Share my screen. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm honored to be in this series to follow Professor Liebman. And really, it's an enormous honor to be in conversation with Jenna Weissman-Josselett, whose work I so admire and have learned so much from, and to speak specifically about material from my last book with her. On Sunday, April 26, 1942, Wentworth Arthur Matthew joined hundreds of thousands of men in New York City and millions of men across the country between the ages of 45 and 64 who had been called to appear before their local draft boards that weekend. Matthew handed the paperwork he had completed to a registrar in Harlem, where he lived. An immigrant from St. Kitts in the British West Indies who had become a naturalized citizen in 1928, Matthew provided his name, date of birth, as you see there, contact and employment information on the front side of the registration form. The selective service process also required that the registrar respond to a series of questions printed on the back of the form. The registrar to do this to describe the man sitting before him or her. And in this instance, Registrar Claire Schwartz noted that Matthew was 4 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 160 pounds, had brown eyes and black hair, and a dark brown complexion. 5 options for race were also printed on this part of the form: white, Negro, Oriental, Indian, and Filipino, and Schwartz checked Negro. But written in her handwriting in tight script above the printed word Negro is the additional label of Hebrew inserted at Matthew's request, which you can see here. Now, the surprise of finding this notation while I was searching for biographical information about Matthew is what led me to ultimately write New World A-Coming and to pursue a range of questions about the relationship of race to religion in this context. And you may have noticed that Matthew included his clerical title of rabbi on the front of the form, even though it was not required information. Clearly, his religious affiliation and status as a congregational leader were important to him. But I was struck by this information on the back of the card, and I wondered whether Matthew understood Hebrew to be primarily a racial designator, an approach that has had a complicated history for Jews of European descent in the United States, or did Hebrew designate both race and religion for him in ways that defied accepted American racial labels of the day, particularly when it came to those classified by the state as Negroes? And we can never recover the details of what transpired between Matthew and the registrar, Claire Schwartz, who herself may have been Jewish, what transpired that led to this amendment of government-supplied racial designators. We do know from the archival record that Matthew was not the only registrant who would ordinarily have been designated as Negro in American law and public culture, to insist that the category could not capture accurately his self-understanding and identity. Indeed, working in this, in the files that are available for research, I found hundreds of such cases among these draft registration cards. In some cases, immigrants of African descent from the Caribbean and Central America rejected the category of Negro as an American creation, and to them, one that was necessarily demeaning and connected to enslavement. And they opted instead to talk about themselves in terms of place of origin or nationality. And so working within the options provided, printed on the form, many modified the supplied category of Indian to designate themselves as West Indian, as you see here. And sometimes with even finer distinctions like British West Indian or Danish West Indian, for example. But what Wentworth Matthew and other figures I'm interested in, who themselves represent many more women and men in their families and communities, so beyond just the men who completed the draft registration card, what they hope to accomplish in insisting on self-representation during the draft registration process was something different from the sort of modification you see on this card. The most striking thing for me about those cards and their assertions in that process is that they were aimed not only at racial reclassification or resignification, but were also meant to link religious and racial identity. And so in my book, I examined several Black religious movements that emerged in northern cities in the context of the significant demographic changes of the early 20th century that generated questions in Black communities about Black religious and racial identity. So in this period, we see the immigration of more than 100,000 people of African descent from the Caribbean, mostly the British West Indians and mostly to New York, but not exclusively, and the migration of Southern African Americans, millions of Southern Blacks, to the urban North in this movement scholars referred to as the Great Migration, all in search of greater opportunity and escape to the extent possible from the oppressive racial structures of legal segregation and racial terrorism. And these Black migrants and immigrants transformed the cultural landscape of northern cities, and their creativity and spiritual questing produced new religious options outside the dominant Protestantism of Black American culture. And we see this in groups like the Moorish Science Temple, founded in Chicago and whose members proclaimed a Moorish Muslim identity. Father Divine's Peace Mission, headquartered in Harlem, and you see him there on the right, and his followers recognized him as God, the God of the Bible in a body, and they rejected race as the creation of the devil. The Nation of Islam, founded in Detroit by W.D. Farad and later led by Elijah Muhammad, who you see here, with a theology that posited the Asiatic Black man as the original inhabitant of the earth. And finally, Black Hebrew congregations in Harlem, who I'll talk about more. And adherents in these groups turned for spiritual sustenance to theologies that provided new ways of thinking about sacred history and geography, about racial identity, ritual life, communal structures, and politics. And I describe these as religio-racial movements to highlight how, in rejecting ascribed Negro racial classification and Protestant affiliation, the founders and members of these movements insisted on the inseparability of racial and religious identity, both individual and collective. Now, by the time Matthew completed the draft registration process in 1946, 2 decades after this religious creativity began to develop in the Great Migration, he was arguably the most prominent and influential Ethiopian Hebrew in the United States. And the Commandment Keepers congregation he led in Harlem, which you see here, a congregation that began as a church, represented an important and growing community whose members articulated a collective Black Jewishness. Wentworth Matthews, Commandment Keepers, and several other early 20th century congregations formulated Black Hebrew identities, navigating relationships to the Jewishness of Jews of European descent, who were sometimes their neighbors, to Black Protestant congregations that constituted the majority in Black religious life in America, and to American Christian communities, many of whom were invested in white supremacy. In my book, I argue that it's essential that we understand the emergence of communities I group under the heading of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations as concerning themselves with both race and religion together, and speaking from and to a particular moment of US religious and racial history. So while an encounter of a type we might think of as, or talk about in terms of Black-Jewish relations, shaped the worlds of these Ethiopian Hebrew congregations, the modes of Black Jewishness they formulated, in part through engagement with the practices and cultures of Jews of European descent, were also directed at reshaping the worlds and self-understandings of Black people, who these Ethiopian Hebrews argued were laboring under the mistaken belief that they were racially Negro and that Christianity was an appropriate religion for them. So their embrace of Hebrew identity, which they framed as reversion, and not conversion, it centered Black people, Black history, and aimed at liberation and collective spiritual thriving. And my attention to this early 20th century history and to this set of figures and communities that I group under Ethiopian Hebrew heading, the attention to them to think about Black studies and Jewish studies in conversation does not include more recently founded groups like the African Hebrew Israelites of Dimona, for example, or various Black Hebrew Israelite groups that were formed in the 1960s and 70s, or even the 1980s. These have different histories, beliefs, politics, different relationships to Jews of European descent than the groups I'll talk about today. And so I want to just put these forward as representing really one strand of Black Judaism among many, past and present. And my discussion also does not include Jews of African descent at the same time the Commandment Keepers and other congregations were founded, who were not affiliated with Ethiopian Hebrew congregations. So for example, Rufus L. Perry Jr. was a prominent lawyer in Brooklyn and the son of a well-known Baptist minister and journal editor. And he converted to Judaism in 1912. And while not likely the first Black Jew, as the headline here contends, or even Black convert in America, Perry brought attention to the possibility that such a thing as a Negro Jew could exist. But for him, it was an individual choice and did not necessarily speak to larger issues about race and religion for Black people. And that's why I find groups like the Commandment Keepers so interesting. And so in my work, I've been interested in what the emergence of congregations whose members embraced Ethiopian Hebrew identity in the changing cultural landscape of the early 20th century urban North reveals about the meanings Blacks in America made of the relationship of race to religion in an era that was marked by the racial strictures of segregation, the violence of racial terrorism, the prominence of eugenics, the passage of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act and all of the discussion around it about race and American national identity, in which American Jews had much at stake, as well as the political, cultural, religious flowering in Black communities that was going on, often spoken of as the Harlem Renaissance. The assertion of Ethiopian Hebrew identity in this period was not only a rejection of an identity adherents found false, that is Negro, but the promotion of a Black Jewishness they saw as divine affirmation of their individual and collective humanity and history in ways they felt Christianity could not provide. And so their understanding of Black Jewishness as Ethiopian Hebrew which they figured in a variety of ways, and I'll talk about some of those, was not a ruse to gain credibility with Jews of African descent, as one commentator argued recently, although they were interested in such engagements. But it really spoke to a long history of African diaspora peoples' religious meaning making through biblical Ethiopia as representative of Africa. Psalm 68:31, princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God, was a rich text for religious charting of possible Black futures in the wake of slavery. And while early 20th century Ethiopian Hebrews claimed connections to Ethiopian Jewish history, they didn't present themselves as part of the Beta Israel, commonly referred to at the time as falashas, but they pointed to an African diaspora history of Ethiopianism, built around reflection on this verse, for example. So to understand how they connected race and religion with Jewishness, we need to look at broader currents in early 20th century Black Atlantic life. And so locating these religio-racial impulses in Black Atlantic and African American religious history rather than the more common approach of comparing various Black Jewish groups to one another and with European American Jewish history as the norm. The approach I'm taking of setting in the context of Black Atlantic history and African American history has the potential, I think, to place Black studies and Jewish studies in dialogue to open new questions, particularly about how race and religion have structured varieties of Judaism and Jewishness in America. Now, that Black Atlantic history includes, for example, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by Jamaican immigrant Marcus Garvey. It was an incubator for the groups I link under the umbrella of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations. And its influence accounts in part for the prominence of Afro-Caribbean immigrants in Black Jewish congregations in this period. Garvey arrived in 1916 in the US and established his headquarters in Harlem, developing the UNIA as a movement with 700 branches in 38 states and more than 200 across the African diaspora. And he proclaimed that Blacks were a transnational, global, and connected people, and he promoted a Black nationalism under the corporate banner of the Negro. You see here the Negro world. And the UNIA's work focused in part on reclaiming Africa as a spiritual and political homeland. And its motto, one God, one aim, one destiny, articulated the grand scale of members' goals. And Garvey labored both rhetorically and materially to achieve this end, right? Calling on Black people of African descent to learn of their race's glorious history, to dispel what he called the inferiority illusion, and to work together through the UNIA to create a strong and united Negro world. And this call to reclaim history and status really influenced the emergence of these congregations. Arnold Josiah Ford, who was an immigrant to New York from Barbados, had been active in Garvey's movement. He served as the UNIA's musical director and composed some of the hymns and anthems members sang at meetings, which he later published along with others in this Universal Ethiopian Hymnal. And Ford, along with a group of fellow Garveyites, came to believe in a literal connection between Black people and the biblical Hebrews, with Africa as the place where that history began. And they formed a study group at the UNIA's Liberty Hall in Harlem and eventually founded two congregations, Congregation Beth B'nai Abraham, where Ford served as rabbi, and you see him there on the left, and the Moorish Zionist Temple under the leadership of Mordecai Herman, who you see in the prayer shawl in the middle, which did not last as long as the Commandment Keepers, for example. So these leaders, along with Wentworth Arthur Matthew, offered their followers a variety of ways of understanding their identity as Hebrews in this period. Not surprisingly, the starting point for their embrace of Ethiopian Hebrew identity was the Bible, and in ways that were mindful of the significance of the Exodus narrative to Africans enslaved in the Americas, but that did more than simply liken themselves to the biblical Israelites through structural similarities. So rather than saying we're like the Israelites, they began to understand themselves as the Israelites. They read biblical and apocryphal texts like Esther and Second Esdras to formulate a history of Ethiopian Jews. Some understood themselves to be connected to the lost tribes who maintained Israelite religion in Africa. And others argued that Ethiopian Hebrews, as distinct from other Ethiopians, had been part of Abraham's tribe in biblical times. Some drew on the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba to argue, as did Mordecai Herman, that Africa and Israel were once united. And he said, quote, "Jewry is from the first born in Africa, and therefore is the whole of Africa Jewish," end quote. And so in formulating what they understood to be their true religio-racial identity around a connection to the place that gave them peoplehood and a history different from that forced on them in slavery, members of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations pursued a strategy that was similar to those in another religio-racial movement, the Moorish Science Temple I mentioned earlier, which looked to Morocco and the ancient Moabites for their history. But even as these religious thinkers identified varied historical ties to the biblical Israelites, they affirmed across these congregations a common Ethiopian Hebrew identity. As E.J. Benson, who was a rabbi ordained by Matthew, asserted, quote, "We are not Gentiles, but are the Ethiopian Hebrews, a brother to the fair white Jew who was in color like the Gentiles," end quote. And you can see in this assertion of Benson's that the leaders and members of these congregations were deeply invested in the labels that described their religio-racial heritage, and they insisted on the use of correct terminology. So Benson there used the term Hebrew for himself and Jew for his white brother. And this was in keeping with the perspective of many of these Ethiopian Hebrews, that the two terms signified different communities, related communities, but with divergent histories. Ford considered white Jews to be descended from the Israelites, so a brother to the fair Jew, but saw their whiteness as the result of intermarriage between Ethiopians and Europeans. So for Ford, and many others followed this pattern, Jewish was a label applied appropriately to Jews of European descent, while people of African descent should be referred to as Hebrews. And it was equally important for Ford, Benson, Matthew, and other Ethiopian Hebrews in this period that they not be referred to Negroes. Ford declared, quote, "All I recognize by Negro is an African or a person of African descent whose mind is a byproduct of European civilization, but has not a tradition of his own. Hebrews are not Negroes." And Matthew made a similar move, designating Negro as a badge of slavery. "Do not submit meekly to being called a Negro," he said. So in this way, these leaders and members of these groups had in common, again, with the other groups I discussed earlier, seeing language as a tool for religio-racial transformation that had religious, social, and political consequences. In addition to reading biblical texts as confirming their identities as Ethiopian Hebrews and interpreting Jewish history as rooted in Africa, some of the founders and leaders of these congregations invoked their own family histories to understand the connection between biblical Hebrews and those West Africans subjected to slavery in the Atlantic world. So these approaches were like those of contemporary ethnologists like the Jesuit Joseph J. Williams, who published a book in 1930 called Hebrewisms of West Africa. By the late 1920s, Ford was also teaching his followers that Hebrew history began in Nigeria and West Africa, and that Israelites migrated to Egypt and eventually Palestine. And there were some leaders who spoke of themselves as Palestinian. Ford, who was born in Barbados and baptized a Methodist, linked himself to this narrative of West African origins of Ethiopian Hebrews through the assertion that his parents had been born in or had a recent connection to West Africa. He said that both of his parents were faithful Jews and that his mother, quote, "lived as a Jewess simply by living as an African," end quote. And for him, this unbroken history of Jewish practice with African origins, combined with his belief that he descended from the priestly Kohan line, authorized his religious leadership and status as a rabbi. And so he ordained several people who then ordained others. He ordained Matthew, in fact. Matthew also invoked a recent connection to West Africa to authorize his Jewishness, sometimes listing his birthplace as Lagos, Nigeria. While these varied ways of authenticating religio-racial identity and narratives of Black Jewishness in the African diaspora led members of these congregations to speak of themselves, again, not as converts to Judaism, but as discovering a true identity that had been taken from them. Maud MacLeod, who was an immigrant from Montserrat and a member of Matthew's congregation, insisted in an interview, quote, "I did not join the Hebrew faith. I returned. I was simply on the wrong road and found my way back," end quote. And in the book, I expand the conventional scholarly focus on male founders and leaders to consider what it meant for people like Maud MacLeod to return to the Hebrew faith. And I was interested in what we might learn in the context of other religio-racial groups about the approaches members took to individual and collective religio-racial transformation. So I considered how in the early years of the movements, members participated in the creation of religio-racial identity. So not simply taking in what the leaders said, but they helped to produce these ideas through practices of self-fashioning, including commitment to this new collective religio-racial label of Ethiopian Hebrew, through individual name changes. So someone like Mordechai Herman takes a Hebrew name, but it was more common in some of the other groups. The adoption of new styles of dress. I explore practices through which members of these groups maintained their religio-racial bodies, such as adopting new practices to diet, health and healing, and death and burial, all of which they understood to derive from their religio-racial identities. For example, Esther Balfour, who you see on the right here, arrived in the US from Jamaica in 1917. She joined the Commandment Keepers in 1936, began taking courses in the school's Hebrew department in 1937. She had been trained as a teacher in Jamaica, but worked in a clothing factory in New York. But because of her religious education, she was able to return to the classroom as a teacher in the congregation's Hebrew school. I also consider a figure like Mabel Hager, who was a native of South Carolina and joined the Commandment Keepers in the early 1940s. And she described in her will her wish to, quote, "be put away in the true Hebrew fashion in the grounds of the Ethiopian Hebrews at Douglas Memorial Park," end quote. This is a cemetery on Staten Island founded by Black Harlem funeral directors to, in their words, halt indignities to the Negro dead. And the Commandment Keepers had a plot there. In her brief written request, which was kept on file with Rabbi Matthew, Hager asserted, quote, "I lived the life of a Jew after I learned who I really was, and I want to be buried as a Jew." And she expressed her hope there that her husband, who I assumed from the will, her husband would abide by her wishes, and I assumed that he was not a member of the congregation. And it was in the context of the work of living as Ethiopian Hebrews that members of these congregations engaged Jews of European descent regularly. They were a curiosity in New York, and many of the early accounts of worship and community life come from reporters, religious leaders, and scholars of European Jewish descent who were interested in learning more. Ethiopian Hebrews also turned to Jews of European descent to provide specialized knowledge, such as Hebrew and Yiddish language instruction and skills for the community, including circumcision and kosher butchery. At the same time, leaders and members of these congregations were clear that they desired to establish Ethiopian Hebrew traditions that distinguished them not only from Jews of European descent, but also from their Black Christian neighbors. The issue of developing appropriate liturgical music, for example, became a point of contention in the 1940s for members of Kohol Beth B'nai Yisrael, located on Lenox Avenue near 120th Street. The congregation had been founded by former members of the Commandment Keepers and was led by Rabbi Julius Wilkins, who was a Harlem native, and Jamaican immigrant E.J. McLeod, who you see on the right here, who had been ordained by Matthew. The group had long used some hymns of Christian origin, as well as music from Marcus Garvey's UNIA, that had been written by Rabbi Ford, but MacLeod wanted what he spoke of as suitable words and music for Ethiopian Hebrews. And he tasked a member of the congregation um, to produce these. Eudora Paris, who had been part of Rabbi Ford's congregation, and she performed with him in early fundraising concerts. And you see a broadside here for one of those. Her lack of progress in this frustrated MacLeod, and it frustrated his desire to distinguish the congregation from their Black Christian neighbors and their neighbors of European Jewish descent. They turned for a while to the Union hymnal, but in this conflict, we see the broader world these communities were navigating in making their religio-racial identity claims. They also engaged in issues on an international context, which I can talk about if you want to know more about their literal engagements with Ethiopia. They remained invested in Ethiopia, engaged in political activism related to its thriving, but they really focused on developing Ethiopian Hebrew identity in the United States. And Matthew and his followers embraced the US. They expressed patriotic connection to America, particularly during World War II. And they supported the naturalization of congregations' Afro-Caribbean immigrants by offering citizenship classes. They also tried to form a small kind of collective residential community in Belmont Gardens in Babylon, Long Island. And I can talk about that more if you're interested. Nevertheless, even though they set out to some other places at various times, these congregations continued to develop in the urban context where they first took hold and have persisted in forging an Ethiopian Hebrew identity, a religio-racial identity for members who are neither on the path to integrating into Jewish communities in America that have their origins in the immigration of Jews of European descent. So they're not on a path to those communities, nor are they interested in claiming status as the only true Jews, which is the case with many of the more recent Black Hebrew Israelite groups. So to understand how their individual and collective identities as Ethiopian Hebrews took shape, I argue in the book that it is as important to locate them in broader currents of thought and practice about the relationship of race to religion in early 20th century Black communities in America, as it is to consider their engagements with European American Jewish history. For those who made a home in Ethiopian Hebrew congregations in the early 20th century, these were largely but not exclusively Afro-Caribbean immigrants, the appeal of membership lay in a narrative of Ethiopian Hebrew religio-racial identity that offered them a history of Black peoplehood not grounded in slavery and subjugation, that rendered them members of God's chosen people and furnished them a platform to challenge and survive white supremacy in America. Thank you.